My daughter did not leave me all at once. That would have been easier to survive and easier to explain. If she had screamed, if she had slammed a bedroom door one last time, if she had chosen some single dramatic moment to break from me, I could have circled that day on a calendar and called it the day my child stopped being mine. But that is not how it happened. It happened the way many of the worst losses happen inside family. Quietly, respectably, one softened edge at a time, one repeated sentence at a time, one small withdrawal of trust after another, until one day I was standing in my own kitchen, staring at my 15-year-old daughter as she gripped the strap of her backpack and looked at me with her father's eyes in her face and his language in her mouth. And she said, in a voice so calm it made the words crueler, "I hate you. Dad was right about you." I did not drop the ceramic bowl I was holding, although for years afterward I would remember the way my fingers tightened around the glazed blue rim hard enough to ache. I did not cry. I did not say, "What did he tell you?" I did not do the thing every nerve in my body wanted me to do, which was to demand that she hear me right then, right there, before whatever poison had settled in her had time to harden further. I stood still at the kitchen island in a house in Franklin, Tennessee, with spaghetti water still steaming on the stove, and the school papers I had graded that afternoon spread beside the fruit bowl. And I looked at my daughter and understood in one cold and total rush that this was not an argument. This was not teenage cruelty in the ordinary sense. This was the end result of something slow, deliberate, and patient, something someone had been building in her for years. Ava's chin was lifted in that defensive, righteous way teenagers get when they are terrified beneath their anger, but have discovered that anger gives them more dignity than pain. Her hair was pulled back badly, as though she had tied it in a hurry in the school bathroom and not checked a mirror. Her eyes were wet, but not enough to soften anything. She looked in that moment too young to carry what she had been made to carry, and old enough to already believe it belonged to her. "Okay," I said, because any larger response would have broken against the wall already standing between us and splashed back over me as proof. Daniel had taught her that too, that my emotion was instability, that my hurt was manipulation, that my insistence was control. I knew it even before she confirmed it. "If that's how you feel," I said, and even to my own ears the sentence sounded like a woman walking across thin ice and pretending the lake below her was not there. Ava laughed once under her breath, a sound with no humor in it. "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You always do this. You act calm and innocent like nothing is ever your fault." She said fault the way Daniel used to say it in the last year of our marriage, softly, almost sadly, as if the word itself hurt him more than the thing it accused. "Dad told me you'd do this." There it was. Not just the accusation, the structure behind it. "Dad told me." I looked at her and knew, with a clarity so sharp it made the room brighter, that she had not arrived at her hatred alone. Someone had walked her there, taking her elbow the whole way. She left 10 minutes later to spend the weekend at her father's house. She took the hoodie I had bought her 2 weeks before, and the geometry binder she had left on the table, and the dog's face in both hands before she kissed his head and walked out without touching me. I stood by the window long after her father's SUV pulled away from the curb and turned out of our subdivision. Kitchen smelled like tomato sauce, reducing too long. The dog paced the back door, confused by the movement and then confused by its absence. My phone sat on the counter without lighting up. Daniel did not send a polite co-parent text explaining that Ava needed space. He did not have to. He had already shaped the atmosphere well enough that silence itself did his work for him. That night I slept badly in pieces, the way people do when their body is exhausted, but their mind has been forced to accept a truth that rearranges its understanding of the past. I lay in bed and replayed not just the kitchen, but years. Phrases, pauses, the looks on Ava's face after weekends with Daniel. The way she had once asked me at 11, "Why did you always need things your way?" The way she had repeated at 13, "Dad says some people don't know how to be happy unless they're in charge." The first time she accused me of making everything heavy. The first time she looked at one of my boundaries as if it were an act of aggression. I had told myself these things were adolescence, grief, divided loyalty, the ordinary distortions of divorce. What I understood now was worse. Ordinary pain had been cultivated. Ordinary confusion had been instructed. There is something almost unbearable about realizing you did not simply lose your child to time or temperament or circumstance. You lost her piece by piece, to a narrative told in a voice she trusted more than her own instinct. When I met Daniel Ellis, None of this seemed plausible. That is one of the reasons I am always suspicious of clean hindsight in other people's story. Evil rarely arrives wearing the face it will later show you in memory. It arrives in a face you could once love without feeling foolish. Daniel was not dazzling. He was better than dazzling. He was gentle. He was the kind of man who carried folding chairs to the backyard before anyone asked, who remembered people's siblings' names, who laughed from the chest instead of the throat, and held eye contact just a second longer than other people did, as if proving he did not fear intimacy. We met at a church fundraiser in Nashville when I was 26 and teaching 5th grade, and still believed that steadiness was the highest form of romance. Daniel was working in commercial insurance by then, well-dressed without being flashy, handsome in a way that improved the longer you looked rather than burning up a room on sight. He listened beautifully. At 26, being listened to felt like destiny. In the early years of marriage, we looked exactly the way families like ours are trained to believe goodness looks. A white house in a good school district, matching red stockings at Christmas, a minivan purchased after practical discussion, rather than financial irresponsibility. Saturday soccer, potluck casseroles, kind of life where the neighbors know your dog's name. And everyone posts identical first day of school photos in August, with children holding letter boards in the same patch of front yard sun. Daniel was wonderful with babies, which is a phrase women say too easily, and men are rewarded for too extravagantly. He was wonderful in the performative slices of parenthood that offer immediate emotional return. Peekaboo, bath time when the towels are still warm, Christmas mornings, elaborate treasure hunts on birthdays. He could make Ava laugh so hard she hiccuped. He could sit cross-legged on the living room floor and become, for 20 dazzling minutes, the sort of father who made other mothers watch with a hunger they did not say aloud. And I, in those same years, was becoming the other role, the one that never photographs as beautifully. I knew the dosage of her antibiotic, when she had the ear infection that would not quit. I knew which snacks made her rash flare. I knew what time the library books were due back, where the missing ballet shoe usually turned up, what form the school nurse wanted signed before field day, how long to let the fever run before calling the pediatrician, and how to say no to a third cookie in a tone that did not start a war. I was the calendar, the structure, the one who saw the bills and the laundry and the creeping sourness, when Daniel said he would handle something and did not. That split is an old American trick inside marriages. One parent becomes magic, the other becomes maintenance. Children do not mean to worship one and resent the other. They simply lean toward the easier weather. If I am being honest, I did not see how useful that split would become for Daniel later. I saw only how lonely it felt. He missed teacher conferences because he got held up in traffic or in meetings, or in one more drink with a client. He forgot permission slips, forgot to move laundry, forgot to call back the roofer, forgot to ask how I was and not just what the week looked like. But he always regretted so well. That was one of his deepest gifts. Regret, when performed by the right person in the right voice, can look so much like conscience that the people around it never notice it is replacing change. Daniel could sit at our kitchen table after missing something important and rub both hands down his face and say, I know, I hate that I'm like this. He would sound less defensive than hurt, less guilty than ashamed, and because he said it before I could say it, I spent years mistaking preemptive sorrow for accountability. The first real fracture came not when I discovered the affair, but before that, in the accumulation of absences that could still be explained. Calls taken on the back porch in February cold, his phone face down on the table when he had never cared before. The faint, patient sweetness in his voice when he said one coworker's name, Celeste Warren, in a way so careful it made the name itself seem breakable. I remember a specific Tuesday in April, because memory likes to anchor itself to irrelevant details when it knows a life is about to divide. Ava was 9. She was in the den watching a baking competition and shouting commentary about frosting while I cleaned the kitchen after dinner. Daniel had left his laptop open at the table because he thought he was going to run out to the garage for one file and come right back. I did not mean to snoop. That is one of those stupid honorable facts that sounds false in hindsight, but happens to be true. I noticed the email only because the subject line in the top corner mentioned Nashville travel, and our anniversary trip had been postponed for money reasons 2 months straight. The message body was already open, and Celeste had written, in a paragraph both intimate and measured, that she could not stop thinking about the hotel room in Atlanta and that pretending to be just co-workers at the client dinner had made her feel like she might come apart at the table. It is astonishing how quickly betrayal can drain all symbolism out of a room you have lived in for years. I remember nothing cinematic, no roaring in my ears, no dropped glass, only a very crisp awareness of surfaces, the grain of the wooden table under my palm, the cheap blue bowl from Target still drying upside down by the sink, the hum of the refrigerator, Ava laughing at something in the other room, the sound moving toward me like it belonged to a different family. Daniel walked back and holding a file folder and stopped when he saw my face. His own changed so rapidly, it would have been impressive if it had not been my life he was responding to. Surprise, calculation, shame, fear, then the first performance of injury. "Maggie," he said, in exactly the same tone he would later use with our daughter when he wanted his hurt to feel moral. I turned the screen toward him without speaking. He sat down very slowly. He did not deny it. That is worth noting, because men who lie badly tend to deny too quickly. Daniel knew when to skip the weak moves. He closed his eyes once and whispered, "Please." I remember laughing then, one short ugly sound, because there is something almost insulting about the smallness of that word after a revelation large enough to split a decade. "Please what?" I asked. He started crying before he answered, which I hated him for more than the affair itself in that exact minute. Crying is not always manipulation, but Daniel had long ago learned the protective power of his own visible pain. "Please don't tell Ava," he said. "Not I'm sorry, not I'm wrong, not I broke us. Don't tell Ava." Even in the first honest room, he was already managing future optics. I looked at him and said the truest thing I knew. "I'm not the one who did that." That could have been the moment I told my daughter everything in age-appropriate terms, and refused to leave the story unwatched. But people who have not raised children through ordinary American domestic life do not understand how much of motherhood is built from prohibitions against making your child carry adult damage. Ava was 9. She still slept with one leg outside the blanket like a child who trusted the world. She still asked me whether clouds moved or we did. The idea of looking at her and saying your father broke this house with another woman felt like violence done in the name of honesty. Daniel saw that immediately. It was the first thing he relied on in me and against me. He swore the affair was over. He swore Atlanta had been the end. He said he had been lonely and stupid and weak and ashamed. He promised he would do whatever I wanted if I would just not poison Ava against him forever. That phrase matters. Not tell the truth. Poison Ava against him. He translated my future honesty into an act of cruelty before I had even decided what it would be. And because I had always been, to my own detriment, the kind of woman who thought character was measured most heavily in the moments you had good reasons to stop behaving well, I chose silence. I chose counseling. I chose 6 more months of exhausting, humiliating, half-repaired marriage in which I kept finding evidence that Celeste was still present in our lives, just in narrower corridors. Burner email accounts, a dinner expense that made no sense, a message deleted poorly enough that a fragment remained on his lock screen. I confronted him twice more. The second time, he did not cry. He grew tired. That was worse. There is a stage beyond apology where a person's betrayal begins to seem to inconvenience them more than it wounds you. "I'm trying," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter with both palms flat and his wedding ring still on. "I don't know what else you want from me." I looked at him and thought, with a clarity that was almost relief, that whatever this was, it was not marriage anymore. The divorce itself was civilized enough to fool outsiders into admiring us. I still want to laugh when I hear people praise clean divorces, as if neat paperwork and low-volume voices indicate mercy. Some of the cruelest unmakings happen inside carefully controlled tone. We sat in law offices with boxed tissues placed optimistically between chairs and divided furniture, accounts, holiday calendars, and custody percentages in sentences so measured they sounded nothing like grief. Daniel did what he always did when a room required him to appear wounded rather than guilty. He lowered his eyes at exactly the right moments. He spoke about trying and failing. He told the mediator he wanted to preserve Ava's stability above all else. He said twice that he never imagined we would end here. It made me feel like I was losing my mind. I knew what he had done. I had emails. I had months of discovered lies. I had the ache of humiliation so constant. By then it had started to feel like one more household task I was carrying. But every formal room we entered privileged the performance he was best at, and the silence I mistook for dignity. I agreed to shared custody because despite everything, I still believed two things that would later cost me dearly. First, that a father who loved his daughter could not bring himself to recruit her into his self-protection. Second, that truth, if left untouched, had some natural gravity that would keep it from floating too far off course. I had not yet learned how aggressively lies can colonize silence. The first time Ava asked about the divorce in a way that made me understand the story was already changing happened in my car, outside a Kroger on a damp Thursday evening. She was 10, sitting in the back with a carton of Goldfish crackers open on her lap, school backpack beside her, rain purling on the windows in slow vertical lines. Daniel had taken her to dinner the night before. She had been quiet since pickup. Then, in the parking lot while I waited for the wipers to catch up to the drizzle, she asked, "Did you stop loving Dad?" Children do not know they are asking legal questions when they ask emotional ones. They only know something has moved in the foundation, and they want the first adult version of it that makes sense. I held the steering wheel and chose my words carefully. I said sometimes adults try for a long time and still cannot make a marriage healthy. I said both parents loved her. I said not everything that breaks is because love disappeared. She listened and then asked, "Dad says he kept trying." There it was. The first seed, small and neat, planted in the dark. Not your father betrayed me. Not your father lied. Not even your father is sad. Just he kept trying, which automatically raises the shadow of its pair. Then who didn't? I told her we both tried. She said nothing after that. But the next day, when I reminded her to finish her science worksheet before television, she looked at me with a new kind of distance and said, "You always need things your way." If you have never had your child speak a sentence that belongs to someone else's private resentments, you might imagine it comes as a dramatic revelation. It does not. It comes like a draft under a door. The room is still the same room, but your body knows weather has changed. Daniel was careful. He never said to Ava, "Your mother ruined us." He did something far more effective. He let grief sit heavily around her, while always making himself look like the person carrying it nobly. "I miss how things used to be," he would say while picking up pizza on a Friday night and letting Ava choose a movie too old for her. "Some people just can't live unless they're in control," he would say in the tone of a man repeating something he hates to admit. "I wanted our family to stay together," he would murmur while helping with a school project, never directly naming me, because naming me would sound like accusation, and accusation is easier for children to reject than atmosphere. By the time Ava was 11, she had begun to repeat his language without even noticing it was not originally hers. "Dad says you always needed control. Dad says he tried harder than you. Dad says you didn't want us to be a family anymore." Each sentence sounded almost conversational. None of them arrived wrapped as propaganda. That was his genius and his brutality. He never forced her to defend him. He made defending him feel like the natural conclusion of paying attention to his sadness. The split between our homes did the rest. Daniel became the fun parent with a precision that still chills me when I think back on it. At his house, there was late-night pizza and movies on school nights if homework was mostly done. There were impulsive drives for milkshakes. He let Ava redecorate her room in phases he could not really afford, string lights first, then a new comforter, then a floating shelf for photographs and succulents. He said yes more than I did, and every yes of his arrived without visible cost, because I was still doing the invisible labor of reality. I was the one checking grades, calling teachers, making dentist appointments, insisting on bedtimes when Ava turned surly with exhaustion, saying no to skipping algebra prep because she had a headache that always somehow disappeared at Daniel's house. Children are not stupid, but they are unfair in utterly ordinary ways. She started to associate my house with friction and his with relief, without understanding that relief often requires someone else to be carrying the weight elsewhere. Daniel deepened this with soft, poisonous affirmation. "I trust you more than your mom does," he told her once when she was 12 and wanted to go to a concert with older girls from school. She repeated that to me, indignant after I said no. "Dad trusts me." I wanted to shout back that trust is easy when you outsource consequence. Instead, I said we had different rules. She heard what Daniel needed her to hear. Mother controls, father believes. The losses came to me in household-sized measurement. A dinner where Ava scrolled through her phone the whole time and responded to my questions with one-word answers, then brightened visibly when Daniel texted. A Saturday morning when she came home from his place with new sneakers and a story about how he had taken her shopping just because, then sulked when I asked whether she had finished the history reading due Monday. The first time she pulled away from my goodnight kiss with the weary patience of someone tolerating a habit she had outgrown. First time she referred to my rules as your thing, rather than our routine. The first time she accused me of turning everything into homework and stress. You do not lose a child in epics at first. You lose her in the altered weather of the sink, the laundry room, the ride to school. The dog still came when I called. Ava did not always. When Daniel proposed family therapy, he framed it in a way that would have sounded saintly to anyone who did not know him. He said he was worried about Ava feeling caught between us. He said he wanted us all to have a safe place to communicate. He said we owed her that. By then I had been carrying the shame of our fractured dynamics so privately and so stubbornly that the thought of professional structure felt almost like rescue. The therapist was named Dr. Marion Keller, mid-50s, soft gray sweater, office with warm lamps instead of overhead lights, and a shelf of books whose titles all promised some version of repair through language. What I did not understand then was that therapy is only as honest as the most manipulative person in the room is forced to be. And Daniel had no intention of being forced. He loved the sessions. He loved the opportunity to narrate his pain in a setting designed to dignify vulnerability. He sat on the couch angled just enough toward Ava to create the impression that whatever he said was for her benefit. He never lied outright in those early sessions. He did what he always did. He arranged truth selectively until it acquired a different moral shape. I think Ava felt the home got heavy, he said once, fingers laced, eyes fixed on the rug rather than on me, as though humility itself were speaking. After the marriage started breaking down, everything started feeling like a test. I know I made mistakes, but I don't think Maggie realizes how much pressure there was in the house. Dr. Keller turned to me. I answered carefully, each word feeling like glass I had to set down without cutting my own hands. The pressure was the marriage breaking, I said, not me trying to create some. Ava looked at me with a teenage version of pity that made me want to leave my own skin. Mom left because she was unhappy and made everyone pay for it, she said one Thursday, seated 2 feet from me while folding the drawstring of her hoodie around her fingers. That sentence did not belong to a 15-year-old girl, not in that shape. It belonged to a grown man who had spent years teaching his daughter to confuse his sadness with truth and my boundaries with punishment. I felt it physically, the way the air changed in my lungs. But I knew better by then than to react in a way that would serve his script. If I raised my voice, she would see volatility. If I cried too hard, she would see instability. Daniel sat very still beside her, the model of grief-stricken restraint. He had built a trap in which any feeling I expressed could be used as a demonstration. That was one of the crueler twists of those years. Therapy, which I once believed could return language to us, became another stage on which Daniel's half-truths acquired professional lighting. The session I remember most clearly was the one where Ava asked, almost casually, "Then what is the whole story?" She was 16 by then. Her voice had dropped into a register that carried more weariness than youth. We were sitting in Dr. Keller's office on a wet November evening. Daniel had spent 15 minutes talking about regret without attaching it to anything specific. I had spent 10 trying to say that there are facts about a marriage that become impossible to discuss once one person controls all the framing around them. Ava looked from him to me and asked that question. And for one instant, I thought maybe we had finally arrived at the ledge where truth might actually step into the room. Then Daniel turned his head toward me with the smallest movement, the kind anyone else would have missed, and I saw in it both warning and invitation. He knew me. He knew that if I told the truth bluntly in that setting after years of silence, it would sound strategic, like a mother finally weaponizing adult betrayal because she was losing the loyalty war. He had inoculated her for that moment long before it arrived. I did not fully understand that yet, but my body understood danger. So I said something smaller than the truth and larger than a lie. I said, "Your father and I are not telling this story the same way." Ava leaned back, folded her arms, and looked disgusted. That's not an answer. She was right. I still did not answer. It is one of the central shames of my motherhood that I can defend and explain forever and still not erase. I thought withholding the ugliest thing was protecting her. In reality, I was letting him tell the story alone. The day Ava left my house to live with Daniel full-time began with something stupid and ordinary, which is often how irreversible things begin. A college guidance packet, a missed deadline for a scholarship essay workshop, conversation about grades that should have been no more than irritation and apology. By then, she was 16, and had perfected the look of a child, trying to survive a mother she had already reduced in her mind to a type. Every correction I made landed as proof of the type. "You turn everything into pressure," she said when I reminded her the workshop mattered. "You don't know how to talk to me unless it's about what I'm doing wrong." I heard Daniel again in the cadence, in the mild sorrow pretending to be objective analysis. I answered more sharply than I should have. "That is also part of the truth. There are years when manipulation does not make you saintly. It simply makes you tired and easier to provoke." We fought in the kitchen, while rain hit the back deck hard enough to sound like small pebbles. She cried, then shouted, then said she could not breathe in my house. I remember the dog barking from under the table, confused and frantic. I remember her calling Daniel before the argument had even fully ended, which means he had long since become not just the alternative parent, but the rehearsed exit. He arrived 40 minutes later. Ava's overnight bag was already half-packed. Later, I would realize that a person does not decide to move houses in under an hour, unless the emotional logistics have been packed for months. Daniel did not come in aggressive. He came in sorrowful, which was worse. He stepped through my front door wearing a rain-darkened jacket and carrying the expression of a man pained by the conflict other people create around. "Maybe she just needs some space," he said, while Ava stood behind him in the hallway with red eyes and a face set into something harder than childhood. "You don't get to say that in my house," I told him too fast. He lifted one hand slightly, calming, performing calm. "Maggie, nobody's trying to take anything from you." But of course they were. That is precisely what was happening. Ava carried her duffel bag to his car herself. She bent to hug the dog goodbye. She did not hug me. That omission contained more violence than anything either of us said. After the taillights disappeared down the street, I went into the laundry room because it was the only room in the house without windows large enough to make me feel exposed. And I cried there with my hands over my mouth, so hard my jaw hurt. I did not post anything. I did not call Daniel's family and tell them what he had done to our marriage. I did not send Ava paragraphs about how she was being handled. I washed towels that did not need washing, because the machine's noise was preferable to silence. This, too, was my failure in some form. I kept choosing the version of motherhood that looked most dignified from the outside, even as it left my daughter inside a story I had abandoned to him. Claire changed the temperature of the narrative for the first time, though not on purpose. She was Daniel's younger sister, never especially close to me while we were married, but always less charmed by him than the rest of the family seemed to be. She called one night, when Ava had been living with Daniel for nearly 4 months. It was close to 11. I was grading essays on figurative language at my kitchen table when my phone lit up. Her voice, when I answered, had that tense, apologetic quality people get when they have realized they are late to a truth and do not know whether bringing it now is help or harm. She said Daniel had been telling the whole family that I couldn't forgive one normal human mistake and had blown up a stable home because I was never really happy being a wife and mother. The steadiness with which she repeated those phrases made them uglier, because it exposed the polish Daniel had put on them. One normal human mistake. Stable home, not really happy being a wife and mother. Every one of them was built to sound plausible at church potlucks, funerals, Thanksgiving table. He was not just talking to Ava, he was building an ecosystem for the lie. Family, by the time it becomes useful in these ways, does not merely repeat words. It creates climate. If all the adults on one side of a child's life are breathing the same softened version of history, the child begins to feel crazy for sensing drafts from somewhere else. After I hung up with Claire, I went upstairs and opened the closet in the guest room where I had shoved boxes during the divorce and then never touched again. I pulled them down one by one into the hallway. That night, I found the evidence box before I knew to call it that. Memory, when given paper, is both mercy and accusation. In those boxes were journals from the year of the affair, emails I had printed because I did not trust Daniel not to erase them from shared accounts, counseling intake notes, legal correspondence, Christmas cards never mailed, and one yellow folder of documents I had not looked at in nearly 7 years because doing so felt too close to exhumation. I sat cross-legged on the guest room carpet with piles around me and read the old version of my own life until 2 in the morning. There was Daniel in black and white saying, "I know I broke this." There he was again in an email to our marriage counselor admitting contact with Celeste had continued after he promised otherwise. There I was in a journal entry 3 days later writing that I still would not tell Ava because I would rather be misunderstood by my child then make her carry adult disgust too early. That sentence undid me in a new way. Not because it was false, because it had been true and still helped destroy us. I had proof, not ambiguous impressions, not maternal intuition, proof with dates and language and confession. And yet I had spent years sitting across from my own daughter, letting Daniel's version stand uncontested, because I could not bear to be the parent who dragged the filthiest facts into her lap. The box on the carpet began to look less like an archive and more like a record of my own compliance with a disaster I thought I was minimizing. Then Ava asked about Celeste, and the whole story changed shape again. She was 18 by then, and in college 2 hours away. We met at a coffee shop near campus, because she had texted that she needed to ask me something and did not want to do it over the phone. It was early spring. Students drifted in and out with laptops and overfilled backpacks, and the place smelled like espresso and wet coats. Ava looked older than she had when she left my house, but not in a comforting way. Some kinds of maturation are really just long exposure to tension. We sat at a table by the window. She did not waste time. "Who is Celeste?" she asked. My chest tightened, then opened, then tightened again. Here I thought at last, but when I answered, carefully, that Celeste was a woman her father had been involved with during our marriage, Ava did not look shocked. She looked tired. "Dad told me you'd bring her up eventually," she said. There are moments when a manipulation becomes so sophisticated, you can only stand back and respect its ugliness even as it ruins you. Daniel had vaccinated her against the truth. He had named the affair first, not fully, not honestly, but strategically. Enough to say, yes, there was someone. But your mother uses it as an excuse because she can't admit she wanted out long before that. Enough to ensure that, when I finally told the same truth, it would sound like a desperate repetition rather than revelation. For a second, I could not speak. Ava watched me with suspicion and hurt braided together so tightly I wanted to reach across the table and cut them apart with my hands. "I have proof," I said finally. The sentence sounded pitiful to me, like I was too late to my own defense. Ava stared at the condensation on her iced coffee. "Dad said you'd have papers," she said. "He said you keep everything because you need to win." I laughed once softly, because there was almost beauty in how perfectly he had inverted me. My record-keeping, my care, my refusal to let memory go unpinned, had become in his version not evidence of survival, but evidence of obsession. "Your father knew I kept things because your father knows what happened," I said. "Those are different." Ava's mouth tightened. "I don't know what to believe anymore." "That," I told her, "is the first honest thing in this whole conversation." She left angry but less certain. That mattered. Certainty had been his strongest weapon in her. Uncertainty, terrible as it felt, was the first crack. Noah widened it without meaning to. He was Ava's boyfriend by then. A quiet young man with thoughtful eyes and the cautious manner of someone who has learned not to intrude where families are bleeding. He came by my house one Saturday because Ava had left a box of old books and winter sweaters in the attic, and asked him to pick it up on his way back through town. He stood in my foyer holding the box while I found 2 more pairs of boots in the hall closet. And in the awkwardness of that small transaction, he asked me, with painful politeness, "Did you really leave because you wanted a different life?" It was the sort of question that sounds almost harmless until you hear the framework beneath. I looked at him and saw at once that Ava had not come to doubt alone. Someone else was listening to the script and noticing its repetition. "Why do you ask that like it's a quote?" I said. He flushed, then told me Ava often began stories about me with "Dad says." "Dad says Mom was never happy here. Dad says Mom hates being wrong. Dad says Mom always needed more." Noah did not accuse Daniel. He did not need to. All he really offered me in that doorway was the confirmation that a person outside the family system could hear the scene. After he left, I stood in the entrance hall with Ava's old boots in my hands and cried harder than I had in months, not because the truth was complete, but because for the first time I did not feel like the only one smelling smoke in a house everyone else called warm. A week later, just after midnight, Ava called. Not texted, called. Her voice was thin with exhaustion or crying or both. "Do you still have the emails?" she asked. She did not say which emails. She did not have to. I sat upright in bed in the dark and stared at the rectangle of moonlight on the opposite wall. "Yes," I said. "Do you want them?" There was a long silence, long enough for me to think she might hang up and disappear back into her father's gravity for another year. Instead, she said, "Not everything. I don't want, I don't know. I don't want all of it. I just need to know what's real." That sentence broke something open in me that had been frozen hard enough to sound like principle. There was no version of giving her that folder that did not feel like failing her on some level. But there was also no remaining version of silence that did not feel like abandonment. The next afternoon, I sat at my laptop for almost 4 hours assembling what I came to think of as the truth folder. I chose carefully. Daniel's explicit sexual messages to Celeste stayed out. The most degrading details of my humiliation stayed out. I was not trying to punish Ava with knowledge. I was trying to return the floor beneath her feet. I included the email where Daniel wrote, "I know I broke this." I included the counselor note confirming continued contact after promised no contact. I included my own journal timeline, but excerpted only the parts that established sequence. I included dates, not gore, admission, not spectacle. When I hit send, my hands shook so badly I had to hold my wrists against the table to steady them. Then she said nothing for 4 days. Those 4 days felt longer than parts of my marriage. Silence with a child who has already once chosen someone else over you is not neutral. It becomes a country you wander in, inventing landscapes of ruin. On the second night, I almost texted her that she did not have to open anything if it was too much. On the third morning, I nearly called Noah, which would have been grotesquely unfair. I did neither. On the fourth day, she wrote only, "I need time." That could have meant anything. I read it 15 times. What I know now is that the human mind resists truth most violently when truth threatens not just a belief, but an attachment. Ava was not simply confronting the possibility that her father had lied. She was confronting the possibility that the person she had poured her loyalty into, defended against her mother, lived with, and let narrate her own pain had used her as an emotional witness stand. People do not surrender that understanding easily. They have to lose more than certainty. They have to lose identity. Confrontation at Daniel's house happened 6 weeks later on a Sunday afternoon, when rain pressed low and gray against every window, and the whole neighborhood smelled like wet mulch and chimney soot. Ava called me at noon and said, very evenly, "Come to Dad's at 3. I need both of you there." I asked no questions because her voice left no room for them. When I arrived, Daniel's house looked offensively ordinary. Basketball shoes by the mudroom bench, a dish towel draped over the oven handle, one of Ava's old science fair ribbons still pinned to the refrigerator, with a magnet shaped like a peach. These domestic details matter because cruelty inside families is so often staged in rooms that continue looking like rooms where people should be safe. Ava was already there, standing in the living room with a manila folder on the coffee table in front of her. Noah was gone. Claire sat in the dining room beyond, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to pretend she did not know what was happening. Daniel stood by the fireplace with both hands in his pockets, and that familiar, careful tension around his mouth that I had once mistaken for sensitivity. Ava looked at him first, not me. "You made me hate her," she said. "I will remember Daniel's face, then for the rest of my life, not because he looked guilty, but because he looked startled in exactly the way powerful people do when the person they have most successfully manipulated stops speaking in their language." He tried immediately to drag the moment back into his terrain. "Ava," he said softly, "that is not what happened." She shook her head before he finished. "That is exactly what happened." Her voice cracked once, then steadied. "You didn't lie all the time. That's what's making me sick. You just gave me enough truth to make the lie feel safe." Daniel turned to me then, as if I might help him manage her. I stayed still. This was the first thing in years that belonged to her, and not to his shaping of her. "I was hurting too," he said, returning his eyes to her. "I should never have put adult pain on you, but I was trying to be honest about my side." Ava laughed, and the sound was so raw and tired it made Claire in the next room cover her mouth. "Your side?" Ava asked. "You made me carry it. You made me carry your version of it until it felt like mine." She opened the folder and took out the email first because she understood, better than I had at her age, that the cleanest cuts are often textual. People can argue with tone. They can argue with memory. They can argue with emotion. It is harder to argue with your own sentence, staring back at you from dated print. She read aloud, voice shaking but precise, "I know I broke this." Then she held the page toward him and said, "Did you write that?" Daniel looked at the floor, then at me, then back to her. "Yes, but you don't understand the context." There it was, the old move. Never full denial when full denial will fail. Always contextualization. Always a plea for nuance that somehow only ever protects the person already holding more power. Ava threw the page back onto the coffee table. "That's the point," she said. "I've been living in your context for years." Daniel moved closer then, slowly, hands half raised in a gesture meant to signal tenderness rather than defense. "Sweetheart, I never wanted you in the middle. You put me there," she snapped, "and you made the middle feel like it was Mom." Then she turned to me, and the scene shifted in the most terrible way, because truths do not land cleanly in families. They ricochet. Her face changed when she looked at me. The fury she held for him collapsed into something more dangerous, something like grief with nowhere to go. "Why didn't you fight harder for me?" she said. "Not why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you fight harder?" That question reaches past facts into the place where motherhood can never fully defend itself. I had spent so many years rehearsing how to tell the truth about Daniel that I had not rehearsed for this part. The part where my own choices would stand in the same room and demand accounting. I sat down because my legs would not stay steady if I remained standing. "Because I thought not making you carry the ugliest parts of it was love," I said. My voice did not sound noble. It sounded old, and because by the time I understood he was using my silence, you were already old enough to have been shaped by it. Ava's face crumpled, then hardened, then crumpled again. "So you just let him?" she whispered. It was not a fair sentence. It was also not wholly unfair. "No," I said, and then had to correct myself because partial truth was what had poisoned us in the first place. "Not on purpose. But yes, I let him tell the story alone, because I thought telling it first would damage you more than letting time sort it out. I was wrong. I wish I could say we all broke then into redemptive tears and walked out of that room with some clean new arrangement. What happened was more faithful to life and far more painful. Ava cried in a way I had not heard since she was little, breathless and humiliated by the loss of control. Daniel cried too, which I hated, because even then some part of me still wanted to protect her from his suffering becoming the center again. Claire came in and sat on the arm of the chair nearest Ava without touching her until Ava leaned into her. I remained where I was on the sofa, because rushing to comfort her in that moment would have felt like trying to claim a victory. Daniel kept saying, "I never meant for this," which may even have been true in the narrow, selfish sense people mean it when they say such things. He had not wanted this exact scene. He had wanted the version of pain in which he got to keep her loyalty and his innocence at once. He had simply pursued that version for so long that he stopped recognizing all the smaller cruelties as cruelties at all. Ava finally lifted her face and said, with the exhaustion of someone moving debris out of her own body, "You used me as the place you put everything you couldn't bear about yourself." Daniel flinched in a way he had not when I accused him of adultery. That sentence found the truest wound, because it named not what he did once, but what he had made of her over time. "She stayed an hour after I left. I know because she called me from my driveway and asked if she could come to my house instead of going back to campus that night. I said yes before the question finished. When she arrived, she walked in carrying an overnight bag and the folder and the expression of someone who had escaped one fire only to realize the smoke had already entered her lungs. We made tea and did not drink much of it. We sat in the kitchen where, years earlier, she had told me she hated me and her father was right about me. And now the room seemed altered but not absolved. Pain had been spoken there in 2 different languages, and both remained in the walls. She looked around after a long time and noticed, with the stunned sorrow of someone finally seeing the evidence of ordinary love she had trained herself not to read, that her old room still looked like a room. Not a shrine, not preserved theatrically, just a place still ready for her. The same lamp, the same bookshelf, the same quilt my mother made when she was born, folded at the foot of the bed. I had never packed her away. She started crying again then, softly and almost angrily, because tenderness can be harder to bear than betrayal when you realize how badly you misread it. "I don't know how to fix this," she said later, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. "We don't fix it tonight," I told her. "We start." It was all I had. It was also true. The months that followed were not healing in the clean, cinematic way people love to narrate over soft music. They were slow, administrative, embarrassing, repetitive, and full of relapses. Ava began therapy on her own, and then with me. In those sessions, we spent as much time talking about language as about events. How she learned to hear sadness as proof. How she learned to confuse my steadiness with coldness, because steadiness was the only surface her father's story could not easily absorb. How I had mistaken my silence for moral superiority, when in fact it had left her undefended. How Daniel's pain had functioned like weather, shaping her mood long before she had the vocabulary to name manipulation. She said once in the therapist's office That what made her sickest was not that he lied. It was that he told the truth in fragments, and arranged them so carefully that she thought she had discovered the lie on her own. That is the most intelligent description of gaslighting I have ever heard. And it came from my daughter at 19, with tears drying on her face. She set boundaries with Daniel that he accepted only in wording, not in spirit. He never gave the kind of full apology people imagine closure requires. He said he was sorry she felt caught. He said he was sorry his pain had spilled over. He said he was sorry if his version had made her feel pressured to choose. The grammar of his remorse remained evasive, even after exposure. But Ava changed before he did, and that mattered more. She stopped letting him use her as his private confessional. When he began a sentence with, "I just need you to understand how hard this has been for me," she interrupted and said, "Then tell your therapist." The first time she reported that back to me over coffee on a windy October afternoon, I felt no triumph, only a deep and saddened respect for the work it had taken her to become someone who could draw that line against her own father. Children should not have to grow that skill from scratch inside the ruins of adult dishonesty. But many do. Noah stayed through all of it. I mention that because young love often flees family complexity, and his staying gave Ava a witness from outside blood memory. He did not turn himself into her savior. He simply kept noticing when she slid back into quoting Daniel without realizing it. And over time, his gentleness did the opposite of what Daniel's had done. It did not recruit her into another person's sorrow. It returned her to her own mind. Claire became, unexpectedly, part of our patched-together truth as well. She admitted more than once that she had seen parts of Daniel's self-serving nature for years, and had done nothing because families train themselves to treat the most articulate wounded person as the most innocent. That sentence stayed with me. The most articulate wounded person as the most innocent. It explained not just Daniel, but half the marriages and divorces and Thanksgiving feuds I had ever watched from near or far. There were setbacks. On Mother's Day, the first year after the confrontation, Ava froze and sent a short text instead of calling because the day itself made her feel guilty toward both of us at once. One December, she spent Christmas Eve with Daniel and came to me on Christmas morning with swollen eyes from a fight he had started after too much bourbon and too little restraint. Once, during a minor disagreement about graduate school applications, she looked at me, and I saw the old reflex flash across her face. The almost spoken accusation that I was making everything heavy. It vanished quickly, but not before we both saw it. Recovery from this kind of harm is not a staircase. It is weather, systems, old grooves. Certain phrases still made her body tense. Certain silences still made mine. And yet something fundamental had shifted. Not toward innocence. We never got that back. But toward alignment. Ava no longer needed me to be perfect in order to trust that I had not engineered her pain. That was enormous. She no longer stood on the opposite side of the truth, looking at me through the soft focus Daniel had built around my face. She began asking different questions. Not why did you leave? Not why didn't you forgive? But what did it feel like when you found out? What made you stay quiet? When did you know he was teaching me to see you that way? The questions hurt, but they were the hurt of contact, not exile. One autumn afternoon, nearly 2 years after that Sunday confrontation, Ava came over with a paper bag from a bakery and a card she handed me awkwardly, as if embarrassed by sincerity. We sat on the porch because the Tennessee air had just turned cold enough to make coffee feel medicinal. Leaves scraped the driveway in intermittent gusts. The neighbor's wind chime clicked without melody. She waited while I opened the card. Inside, in her uneven adult handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for still being there when I came looking for the other side." I read it twice because the first time I could not absorb the simplicity without wanting to improve it, to make it prettier or more complete. But it was complete, not redemptive, not total, just true. I looked up and she was watching me with the expression of someone who had learned that love can survive distortion and still never return to its original shape. I reached across the small iron table and covered her hand with mine. Her fingers did not flinch away. People always want family stories to end in one of two ways. Either total estrangement, which comforts outsiders because it makes the moral lines clean, or full reunion, which comforts them because it suggests truth heals what it touches. Our story did neither. Daniel remained her father. He remained in her life. He remained in many ways exactly himself. I remained changed too. There are things I will never again trust silence to do for me. There are lies I now understand can be built entirely from truths arranged by a frightened person who wants to keep love without deserving it. There are ways my daughter studies mood in a room that I know were learned too young and at too high a cost. No one walked out of this untouched. That is the truest ending I can offer. But there is this, and it matters. She came back, not to the childhood we lost, not to the family we once looked like from the outside. None of us could return there. She came back to the truth, which is colder and harder and often less flattering than memory, but steadier. She came back to a life in which her father's sadness no longer got to define reality for everyone else. She came back to a version of me that was no longer filtered through his injury. And for the first time in years, we were standing on the same side of it.